It's most Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Bonnie, will you dim the light?
Do you want to
Huh? The light will be like this or dimmer? Hey, can you dim and see how it works?
You go to Palau or Seychelles or
Not Seychelles. I got back yesterday. A little both. We're in free radars up there. Yeah. Usually the places I'm diving are like 2 feet of visibility. And they'll do it. It's a big lagoon. It's like 10 miles. I've got sports out there. Well, one day it was just absolutely epic. So it's like
I can dim the back ones too, if you want.
I'm trying to see it. You're live, by the way.
Oh, great.
Western side's gonna pass.
San Francisco.
So it's been different. We just finished this time. It's hard to it's never commingling family problems. Well, now I got to do my third boy.
He can probably be reached by satellite phone.
Okay, Bonnie, you on? Careful. Okay, you're online. Hey, Bonnie. Hello. Bonnie, Ricardo asked if he can ask questions from the video chat.
Sure, let him.
You have a lot of battery on your phone.
I have some.
It's like I can check the live chat for you if you want.
Well, I put on airplane as well.
Huh? I don't have a USB. I don't have a charger with me.
Okay. My calendar's reminding me I need to defend.
Huh?
My calendar just reminding me.
Okay. What's the link?
It's just my history is safe now.
Because I think we copy and paste it. Yeah, that's what you're looking for. That's what you're looking for. Listen, looking how to do the music is completely music now.
Okay. Yeah, I was doing my friend play when they were done. Is it okay with the lights on in the back, or should I get this one? Thanks for coming. Hey, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
at the start. We are for the Thesis defense of Bonnie Bloodgood. Bonnie's been here for a little bit over 6 years. She came from James Madison with a physics degree, and she's been studying waves and currents and the same transport. And the format will be, she will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then she'll entertain questions from the audience, and then she'll talk with us in the oh yes, at 4 o'clock, at Surfside, will be libations.
Winner vote.
All right, thanks everyone for being here today. I'm Bonnie, and this is my thesis defense. So today I'll talk to you about wave-driven beach sand level changes in Southern California. So first off, I have wanted to acknowledge our funding agencies, Sea Grant, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Cal State Parks and Recs, and then also NSF grant that I was funded on for the first 3 years of my research. So why should you care about beach sand levels? Well, high beach sand levels can protect coastal infrastructure, or low sand levels can predispose coastal infrastructure to flooding. Here's some pictures of local flooding in San Diego County. Similarly, beach sand levels can protect coastal infrastructure, or low sand levels can predispose it to erosion. So here's a picture of a house atop a cliff in Acadia, just in North County here. And this cliff has failed because it's been undercut by waves that have struck the back of the beach there because their sand levels there are very low. Beach sand levels can also influence coastal economies. As my advisor likes to say, if you took all the people on the beach and you flipped them upside down and you shook them, there'd be a whole lot of loose change lying around. So, and there have been economic studies that show that the width of the beach actually does affect the strength of the local tourist economy. Also, your tax dollars are used to engineer beach sand levels. And we'll talk quite a bit in the last chapter about something called beach nourishment, where sand is taken from offshore and then placed on the beach. Beach sand levels are also an international issue. 1 billion people live within 10 meters of present sea level. That population is increasing drastically, and sea level is rising. Okay, so it's important. So how do we monitor beach sand levels? Well, we've been monitoring at 5 different sites in San Diego County, and we use 3 survey vehicles, an ATV, a push dolly, and a jet ski. And all these vehicles are equipped with GPS, and the jet ski is rigged out with an acoustic sonar. We drive the ATV on what I'll call the subaerial beach. This is the exposed part of the beach, the stuff that's not underwater, so I'll be using that word a lot, subaerial. And then the jet ski gets the stuff all the way out to 8 meters depth, so that's about 24 feet deep. And then the push dolly gets everything else in between. We drive the ATV once a month, and then 4 times a year we take out all of our survey vehicles to get from the back beach out to 8 meters depth. As I said, we've been monitoring at 5 different sites in San Diego County. We used to monitor at Camp Pendleton. We monitored there for 4 years, and we've stopped due to permitting issues. But at all these other sites, we're still monitoring. We have been monitoring for 5 years at Imperial Beach, 6 at Solana, 7 at Cardiff, and our longest record is at Torrey Pines with 15 years. Okay, so what does one of our beach elevation surveys look like? Here's an example at Imperial Beach, and the Google Earth image on the right is to help orient you. We've got land on the right, ocean on the left, and the colors in this figure represent elevation. So this is from one of our quarterly jumbo surveys, what we do 4 times a year, where we take the ATV, the jet ski, and the push dolly out, and we drive all these vehicles in a cross-shore direction. It's a really bad idea to drive jet ski in any other direction through the waves, so that's why we have our transit space like that. And they are spaced about 100 meters apart in the along shore. Then also, additionally, once a month, we drive the ATV in the alongshore direction, along transects that are spaced about 10 meters apart in the cross shore. All right, so that's our beach sand level data set, but in order to understand beach sand levels, we have to know what the waves are doing. So to monitor the waves, we use the CDIP buoy network. On the left is a map of the locations of the buoys in the Southern California Bight, where the red dots show the locations of the buoys. And then these buoys are used to initialize a spectral refraction wave model, and an example of that numerical output is on the right, where the colors represent significant wave height. These buoys and this numerical model combined give us hourly wave estimates every 100 meters along shore in 10 meters depth. Okay, so we know the sand levels and we know the waves. So what have I done with this awesome data set? Well, here is my thesis outline. And I'm rearranged my thesis a bit just for the purposes of this talk. So I've kind of divided it into different themes. And the first theme is beach profile evolution. So that's going to consist of chapter 1 of my thesis, so some introductory material. And then also it's going to be this paper that was just published last year in the Journal of Geophysical Research. Theme 2 is all about El Nino beach response. We're going to have some intro there, and then part of this theme is going to be included in the recent Geophysical Research Letter publication that just came out a few weeks ago. And lastly, we'll talk about beach nourishment evolution. So that'll have some intro, and then again, there'll be some of that paper or some of that Geophysical Research Letter paper in there, and then also there will be chapter 4, which is in prep for coastal engineering. So that's where we're going with this. So theme 1 is beach profile evolution. Let's get started on that. And just to point out some terms that we like to use on the beach profile. I'm going to point out that this is what we call a summer burn, and this is a winter offshore bar. So these are the typical shapes of the beach profile in Southern California. And to further introduce this topic, we're going to get the help of the late Doug Inman, founder of Coastal Oceanography, who is my advisor's advisor and my academic grandfather. Doug Inman made this movie called The Beach, A River of Sand, in collaboration with John Shelton from Encyclopedia Britannica Films. And it's about a 20-minute long video that you can watch on YouTube. You should totally go check it out if you're curious about beach sand levels after this. I'm just going to show a couple 2-minute clips. So here is your introduction to beach profile evolution.
The sand comes and goes according to the sea. At the end of a summer, the beach is piled high. At the end of a winter, the sand is gone. The following summer, the sand returns. But why? In summer, the waves that wash up on this beach are small and carry less energy than the winter waves, which are bigger and more powerful. Such seasonal changes in wave size may be the cause of the seasonal changes in the beach. Let's check this idea. This is a model beach in a wave tank. We'll be able to make waves of different kinds in the tank and see what effect they have on the beach. First, we'll make some small waves, the kind that are most common in summer. To speed up the process, we'll use the time-lapse camera and condense 2 hours into 30 seconds. The small summer waves push the sand toward the shore in the form of migrating sandbars. Eventually, the waves push enough sand onshore to form a steep beach face. Now watch what happens when we make bigger waves, the kind that strike the beach in winter. waves gouge out sand from the steep slope and deposit it as sandbars offshore.
All right. So thanks to these guys for that little introduction. But don't let them fool you. There's still a lot that we don't understand about these processes. And that's because sediment transport is a difficult problem. For example, this is an article that was published in Nature Materials in 2007, and this is a review article describing all the different progress that has been made on how to describe grains that are identically sized, and they're all spherical, and they're flowing down this chute under gravity. So this is the schematic of that, and on the right, you're seeing a numerical model that models 10,000 grains flowing down this slope. The colors show a dimensionless velocity. So we're still working on this problem, which means sand transport in the surf zone is a really difficult problem, which is good for me because I've got great job security. So it's very difficult because we've got grains of different sizes and shapes, and they're being moved around by waves that are not linear and turbulent. So yeah, it's a difficult problem. And there are a few different ways to approach this problem. You can first assume that you know, you can assume some governing equations that may or may not be right, and then you can test them against observations and see how you do. Or you can collect a bunch of observations, look to the observations, and then try and say something statistical based on what you see in the observations. So in this case, we've done the latter. We looked to the observations first. And to do that, we set out to test the equilibrium hypothesis, which is an age-old hypothesis, and it's that under steady wave conditions, a beach will evolve toward a unique, wave condition dependent equilibrium beach profile and will experience no further change after equilibrium is reached. So in cartoon form, what that means is if you have a beach profile in some hypothetical offshore wave conditions, this beach will evolve toward an equilibrium shape. So the beach will evolve there at first rapidly and then ever more slowly. You can also have a different case where you have different incident wave conditions, and there is a separate equilibrium beach profile for those incident wave conditions. And again, the beach will evolve there at first rapidly and then ever more slowly. So as I said, this idea has been around for a while. It was first introduced in the literature by Per Brun. Well, this is the canonical reference, Per Brun, 1954. And Brun acknowledges that the idea has been around since before he actually wrote it down. And this idea is very much alive and well in the literature today. But we are the first to set out and test it with observations of the profile. But in order to do that, we needed a way to put a number on the beach profile, to quantify the shape of the beach profile. So to do that, we used something called empirical orthogonal function analysis, also known as EOF analysis. And this is just a statistical method to identify the dominant patterns in the data set. So we're specifically going to look at the mode 1 EOF, and that is the mode that explains the most variance in the data set. So this is the most dominant pattern in the data set. We are not the first people to do EOF analysis on San Diego beaches. Wynett and friends published some work on this in 1975. So what is novel about our work is that we're going to take this analysis and then we're going to do something more with it. So what I did is I took all of our beaches and I broke them up into different alongshore chunks. And these alongshore chunks were about 700 meters wide alongshore. And then I alongshore averaged them. And I looked at each of those sections of beach. I looked at the profile evolution of each of those sections of beach. And I also identified which of those sections were sort of normal sandy sections and which ones were weird, as in they had an offshore reef, there was a submarine canyon, or there was a lagoon mouth there or something. And what we found was that the EOF analysis did a very good job of describing the variability at the normal sandy sites. So at those sites, the first mode EOF explained more than 50% of variance. So this is a good way to identify the dominant pattern in the data set. To do this analysis, we first remove the mean profile, which is what you're seeing in the bottom panel here, this is the UF analysis that I ran at a particular section of beach at Torrey Pines. And the top panel shows you the beach spatial shape function, or what I'm calling the Barburn, mine called the Barburn function. So what this means is that when the upper beach is accreted, the offshore region is eroded, and vice versa. So you either have a berm or you have a bar, and the sand just is exchanged between these two regions of the beach. In the bottom panel, or sorry, in the middle panel is the temporal amplitude of the EOF, which is what I'm calling the beach state. So this tells you at a given point in time what state the beach is in. So for example, if you have a positive beach state, so where this red dot is, if you multiply that number by the spatial shape function in the top and then add back in the mean, you get this reconstructed profile. So this profile is slightly burned. In the opposite case, if you have a negative temporal amplitude or a negative beach state, we get again, multiply that by the top function, add back in the mean, and you get this barred profile. So that's how the UOF kind of works. And as I said, we're going to take this analysis and then we're going to do something more with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the information from the temporal amplitude, this beach state time series, at each of those longshore sections of beach that I analyzed, or at least the ones where the UF does a good job, so at the normal sandy extents. And then we're going to use that to create the plot in the upper left. Let me walk you through this. So we took each pair of consecutive surveys. We looked at the beach state that we identified in each of those surveys, and we called the first of those pairs of surveys the initial beach state, and that was plotted on the x-axis. Then on the y-axis is the average wave energy that was experienced between those two surveys. And lastly, the colors represent the beach state change rate. So on the left of this plot, we've got initially barred profiles. On the right of this plot, we've got initially burned profiles. And then the red represents a change toward a barred profile, and the blue represents a change toward a burned profile. So if you're like me before you got into this business, you might think that all big waves remove sand from the upper beach face, and all small waves bring sand back to the beach face. But in fact, if that were the case, this plot would be all red at the top, and it would be all blue at the bottom. But that's not what we see. Instead, what we see is something more consistent with the equilibrium hypothesis. Let me walk you through it. So say you have some incident wave energy of like 0.06 meters squared. And what that means is you've got a significant wave height of about a meter. So you've got waves hitting the beach that are about 3 feet tall. And say that those waves are incident on a profile that is in a slightly barred state. Those waves will move the profile in this way. So they're going to bring sand back to the upper beach face. In a different situation, with different initial condition, so if we have an initially burned profile, those same waves will actually do the opposite thing. So they'll remove sand from the upper beach face. So same waves, different initial condition, different behavior. But what's actually happening is that these profiles are both evolving toward the equilibrium state. So what this says is that this is observational evidence for the equilibrium theory, which is pretty cool. So once we identified this pattern, we decided to go ahead and make a simple model to exploit this pattern. So to do that, we're going to define an equilibrium wave energy. And this is the wave energy that if you're in a particular beach state, that wave energy will not change anything about your profile. So this is the state, the wave energy that the beach is in equilibrium with. And we're going to go ahead and assume that there is a linear relationship between the beach state and the equilibrium energy. We're assuming it's linear because that's simple, and we want to keep this as simple as possible. And then for our simple model of the beach state change rate, we're assuming the beach state change rate is not only proportional to the incident wave energy, but it's also proportional to the wave energy disequilibrium. So this term just determines the sign of the beach state change rate. If you have waves that are lower energy than the equilibrium energy, that beach will change toward a Barton profile. If you have waves that are more energetic than the equilibrium energy, that beach will change toward a Barton profile. So that's how this works. And this model has a few different free parameters. It has 2 for the equilibrium energy and 2 for the change rate coefficients. And this is 1 for erosion, 1 for accretion. And these parameters are fit to the data set. However, we don't actually fit them using this plot. And that's because our surveys are spaced apart in time by a few months. So we want to be able to resolve individual storms. So what we do is we find these parameters by running the model forward using hourly incident wave energy. So that is resolving storms. We do that a bunch of times until we find the best parameters, and then we're doing that in a way that is a nonlinear optimization scheme. But I don't need to go into details of that. But what I'm trying to tell you is that these parameters are fit to the data, but in a way that we're trying to account for the fact that we do have storms. This model is based on the same framework that Yates and Friends used in 2009 for their shoreline equilibrium model. Now we're using it to look at the beach profile state. And these types of equilibrium models were very much inspired by Wright and Short, 1984, and Wright et al. 1985. Okay, so how does the model do? Here is some model output at that same section of the Torrey Pines. In the top panel is the incident wave energy. So you can see we get big waves in winter and smaller waves in summer. And then in the bottom panel, in blue, is the observed beach state. So that's just from the temporal amplitude of the UF, where positive means you have a berm profile, negative means you have a Barton profile. And then the red shows the model. And you can see that the model and the observations agree quite well. And that is actually the case at all of those normal sandy sites. This is showing the model skill and the normalized mean square error. The skill is high, above 0.75, and normalized mean square error is low, less than 0.25 at all these sites. So the model does a good job. So I'm going to actually just leave it at that. The model does a good job at these normal sandy sites. And just go ahead and recap this theme for you, which is the observations suggest that beach profiles evolve toward equilibrium. And an equilibrium framework well models the temporal variability of the beach profile state in Southern California. I will point out that this model does fail where the first mode UF fails, so it doesn't work in all situations. And it also doesn't do well in extreme events. So, for example, we had some really big waves in 2009 and 2010 because that was an El Nino year. And the model overpredicts erosion for that event. And it does that. It overpredicts erosion at all the different sites for that event. And we think that that's because this model does not take into account that at many of these beaches, the sand was removed and all that was left was bedrock or cobble. So of course the model just keeps eroding as if there's sand, so it's going to overestimate the erosion there. But the reason I bring this up is because extreme events, by their nature, they're infrequent, so we don't have many observations. So that's why they're particularly hard to model and particularly hard to understand. So we really value observations of extreme events, which is why it was cool that we had another El Nino year this winter, which brings me to theme 2, El Nino beach response. All right, so first off, real quick, what is El Nino? Well, in a normal year, the circulation in the equatorial Pacific, we've got trade winds blowing from east to west, and they move the warm waters at the equator westward. In an El Nino year, those trade winds weaken, and that warm water flows from the west to the east. So we've got warmer water in the eastern Pacific. Also does is it modifies the location and the strength of the jet stream. So in a typical El Nino year, you've got the jet stream set up farther north, in a typical year, you've got the jet stream set up farther north and kind of comes into the US around British Columbia, Washington, Oregon And it sets up there because that's where the maximum temperature differential is. So that's where it changes very quickly from warm to cold, which is sort of like equatorial waters meeting the polar waters. But in an El Nino year, the largest change in temperature is at sort of the edge of that warm pool. So we get the maximum temperature differential is moved farther south. So the jet stream sets up farther south, and we get storms that are generated farther south, which means we get bigger waves. So for us, nearshore people, El Nino means big waves, which also means increased erosion and increased flooding. And the dominant mechanism of that flooding is actually from something called wave setup. And what wave setup is so this is your mean water level, and waves create a flux of horizontal momentum as they pass by, and when they start to break, that momentum has to go somewhere, so it actually raises the water level in the surf zone. And it can raise it by up to a meter if the waves are really big, like in El Nino year, which means we get flooding. So El Nino means big waves. So how did this El Nino look? Well, this is the sea surface temperature anomaly of this El Nino just in February 2016. What this means is this is how much warmer these waters were compared to the long-term average. So the red means it was warm in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific. And as oceanographers have a method for identifying how strong these El Ninos are, we look in this region at the sea surface temperature anomaly. So if we look at a time series of the sea surface temperature anomaly in this region, here it is. This is what it looks like. And you can see the recent El Nino, which I guess we're kind of still in, actually. Anyways, the El Nino is there, and it is actually largest in this 70-year record, or one of the largest in the 70-year record. So this was a very strong El Nino by this metric. So what we care about is how big were these waves during this recent El Nino. So this plot is showing a time series of the number of hours that wave height exceeded 2 meters in each month. So this is how many hours of big waves did you get? And when we published this paper, we tried to get this paper out right in the middle of this El Nino to really be the sort of a news story report on this. And we, when this came out, had waves up through February. And this is from a buoy at Torrey Pines. And so what I've done is we've highlighted the El Nino years in red, and in 2009, 2010, by February, there were 360 hours of these big waves that exceeded 2 meters. By February of this year, we had 364 hours of big waves. So what this is saying is, yes, this El Nino brought big waves. By this analysis, it's saying that it was similarly, there were waves that were as similar to the waves that the 2009-2010 El Nino brought. In contrast, if you look at the non-El Nino winters, they have no more than 200 hours of 2 meter exceeded. So these are really big wave years. I'm collaborating on a paper with some folks up in Santa Cruz at USGS, and they're kind of taking a wider look, and they're included a wider look in that they're looking across the U.S. Pacific coast, and they have now included the rest of this winter, where we continue to get some big waves. And they see that this El Nino did bring bigger waves even than the last El Nino. So the moral of the story is we got big waves. And then what we really want to know is how devastating were these big waves for San Diego County beaches? Well, let's look at the Severial Beach. This is really the part of the beach we care about. This is where the ATV drives. And we know from the last chapter that sand leaves this region in winter and returns to this region in summer. So if we look at a time series of the volume in this region, this is what it looks like. And I've actually normalized this by the area of our survey region. So what you're seeing is the average width of the height of the sand on the beach. So you see that the volume, we've got more sand on the beach in summer, less sand on the beach in winter. And during that 2009-2010 winter, we had very strong erosion. So there was not a lot of sand left on the beach. And in fact, this past winter, we even had less sand on the beach. So we had a very erosive winter. And just to brag a little bit, I did say that our model does overpredict erosion as it does during these extreme events. But it did actually get it right that this El Nino was just slightly more erosive than the last one. This is the model that you saw in the last chapter. All right, so a picture tells 1,000 words. Let's look at what Torrey Pines looked like in February of 2016. And here you can see that the beach there's no more sand on the beach. It's been eroded down to cobbles. We're very little sand on the beach. It's been eroded down to cobbles. And tourists are enjoying the ocean from the curb of the eroding highway instead of sitting on the beach. All right, so that's what happened at this beach at Torrey Pines. However, at our other survey sites, things were a little bit more complicated because those beaches had recent beach nourishments done. So that brings me to theme 3, which is beach nourishment. And again, so for beach nourishment, what the practice here, at least, is that we suck up sand from offshore, we put that sand on a barge, drive it over to the coast, spit that sand out in a slurry, just sand and ocean water mixed together, put that on the beach, and then we move that sand around using bulldozers, and that's what you're seeing a picture of here. So this is beach nourishment, and this is the mechanical placement of sand at Imperial Beach, where you can see the narrow, unnourished beach at the top of the image, and the wide, nourished beach in the foreground. Just to give you some context, the amount of sand that was placed on this beach is equivalent to 120 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of sand. That's a lot of sand. In this image, I think they're about kind of halfway done. They're still continuing to put sand down this way. All right, so why would you do this? Well, beach nourishments are placed to protect coastal infrastructure from flooding and erosion, and they're placed to promote coastal tourist economies, often multi-billion-dollar tourist economies like we have here in San Diego County. This is a current and a local issue. $30 million were spent on beach nourishments in San Diego County in 2012. And there is a 50-year plan to nourish San Diego County beaches every few years, which is not cheap. So this is also an international issue, as this is a primary coastal management technique worldwide. Despite this being a common technique all over the globe, and despite it being very expensive, there's still a lot that we don't know about the wave-driven redistribution of this sand. So we'll take a look at 4 different beach nourishments that were done here in San Diego County, and we'll have a look at how this sand was redistributed in the cross-shore, and how it was redistributed in the longshore. All right, so let's take a look at these nourishments. Just to help orient you. What you're looking at is a plan view of the subaerial beach just after the beach was nourished. So these are the sand levels, and these are the sand levels relative to the long-term mean. So if it's blue, that means it's more accreted than it would be, or than it was on average. So the very dark blue means that these beaches were elevated 3.5 meters above what they are on average. So it's a big increase in elevation. The Torrey Pines Beach was nourished in spring of 2001, and Imperial, Cardiff, and Solana beaches were nourished more recently in 2012 in fall. As I said before, Imperial Beach received a big amount of sand. It got 300,000 cubic meters of sand, 120 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of sand. Torrey Pines received about half of that. Solana Beach received 100,000 cubic meters. Cardiff received the least with 50,000 cubic meters. Something that is important to note is that Torrey Pines received sand that was a grain size that was similar to the native grain size. So this is about a grain size of about 0.2 millimeters in medium grain size. Imperial, Cardiff, and Solana beaches all received sand that was relatively coarse. These are larger grain sizes. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because coarse grains are harder for the waves and the currents to move. what you're looking at here is a plot of fall velocity, which is if you took a grain of sand and you dropped it in water and you timed how fast it was moving through the water column. This is what you're looking at here. And the x-axis is showing you the grain size. So for fine sand, the fall velocity is much slower than for coarse sand. So coarse grain sand falls back to the bottom very quickly. So even if you lift it up off the bottom, it's falling back quickly, so the waves and the currents don't have much time to move it around. So that's why it's hard to move. A couple more specs on these beach nourishments. What you'll see here is instead of plotting the, this is still that same survey just after beach nourishment, and instead of plotting the elevation fluctuation, I've plotted the elevation relative to mean sea level. So all the yellow stuff is kind of the part of the beach that is typically above water. And I'm showing that all these nourishment pads were built to a similar elevation of about 3.5 meters above the sea level. I'm going to go ahead and spoil this story for you and tell you that Imperial, Cardiff, and Solana beaches, these coarse grain nourishments placed in 2012 all sort of behave similarly, more or less. And so I will sometimes talk about Imperial Beach as representative of Cardiff and Solana. Let's have a look at some movies of how these nourishments evolve. First, we'll start with the nourishment at Torrey Pines. This is to help orient you. At this survey region, we've got the city of Del Mar in the north, Torrey Pines State Park in the south, and the Los Penasquitos Lagoon is in the north central region here. This nourishment was reported on in detail by Yates and Friends in 2009. I revived it because I wanted to compare this data set to the more recent nourishments. So we're going to watch this movie of the nourishment evolution, and the region that we're looking at here is here. So this is from the back of the beach out to 8 meters depth. And the nourishment was placed kind of right in front of Highway 101. And again, this is elevation fluctuation, so if it's blue, that means it's more elevated relative to the long time mean. So that beach nourishment is a hyper elevation of the beach. So I'm going to go ahead, play this video, and you can watch how this sand moved around. And this nourishment was placed on a slightly eroded beach and in the spring. And then summer came, and the beach around it actually accreted. So the beach around it started gaining more sand. The nourishment itself didn't move all that much, although it did sort of diffuse a little bit near alongshore. And yeah, so we kind of sat there all summer, but now I want you to keep your eye out for the first winter storm, which is coming up here in mid-November. Here we go. Whoa, there goes the nourishment, all in one storm there. So the nourishment sand was washed offshore. It's placed in an offshore bar and sits in that offshore bar over winter, and then in summer, the sand starts to come back to the upper beach. And as you might expect from what you know now about the seasonal cross-shore rocking of San Diego beaches, this sand then goes back offshore in winter in an offshore bar. We have this seasonal exchange sand. All right. So that was Torrey Pines. Now let's look at the same thing at Imperial Beach. This beach is down near the U.S.-Mexico border. We've got two sort of stubbed jetties in the north, a recreational pier here, and we've got the Tijuana River mouth in the south, which can sometimes be super gross. This thing spews raw sewage at times, and so if we had a recent rain, that means that we don't get in the water here, so we have much less data, bathymetric data here than we do at the other sites. Anyways, so also this nourishment pad was placed in front of these homes that have the estuary in their backyard and the ocean in their front yard, and they're also at super low elevations. I have no idea how they were built there, but they are. So again, that nourishment pad was put right in front of them. And so we're going to watch a movie. Again, this is from the back of the beach all the way out to 8 meters deep. And I've outlined the original nourishment placement region with that black box. And this movie jumps forward in time much quicker. So now we're already on to we're 2 years after nourishment. But you can notice a few things. I'll replay this a couple times. But what you see here is that the nourishment sand is still very much on the upper beach, and it's stretched to the alongshore a bit. And you do see that play again, you do see that seasonal cross-shore exchange of sand. You can see the offshore bar here, and then it comes back to the beach there. So you see a cross-shore exchange of sand, but this cross-shore exchange is a little different because much of that sand still stayed on the upper beach. So we have a question of why did this sand stay on the beach, whereas the Torrey Pines nourishment was washed away in a single storm. So to look at that, we will look at, again, subaerial volumes. And I'm just reminding you that in this region, we get sand leaving in winter, sand coming in summer. So we're going to look at the subaerial total amount of sand in this region, time series of that. And let's first look at that at Torrey Pines. You've seen this time series before, but I only showed you the second half of it before. Now we're looking at the whole thing back to 2001. And what you see here is the annual cross-shore exchange of sand. So we've got more sand in summer than you do in winter. And here's the market of nourishment. Remember that nourishment kind of sat there in summer, but the beach around it accreted. And during that first storm, that nourishment washed offshore. We also have the market of the El Nino over here, very eroded winter, and the super erosive winter that we just saw. Now let's compare that to what happened at Imperial Beach. At Imperial Beach, again, we see an annual cross-shore exchange of sand. We saw a super eroded beach in 2009, 2010 because of the El Nino waves. Here is the nourishment. And this nourishment very much stayed on the upper beach. It lasted for several years. And even during the significant wave attack of this El Nino, this beach was much more elevated than it would have been compared to the last El Nino. So we're protected by this beach nourishment. Let's compare to the other sites. Same story here. The Cardiff and Ceylon nourishments very much stayed on the upper beach. And again, these beaches were more elevated compared to what they were during the last El Nino. So if we look at pictures from February of 2016 during the big waves of El Nino, you recognize this one. This is showing that super eroded beach at Torrey Pines. And here is what Cardiff and Imperial Beach looked like. These guys were still relatively sandy. So that's what happened this winter. And so again, why did these nourishments stay on the beach, whereas that 2001 nourishment at Torrey Pines, it washed away in a single storm? Well, maybe it was because the waves were different. So here's a look at the waves that we experienced just after nourishment at Torrey Pines. And this is that storm that washed the nourishment away. This is daily average wave height. Now let's look at what happened at Imperial Beach. Here are the waves of Imperial Beach. You can see that these waves were just as big, actually bigger at times, especially big during the recent El Nino. So that native grain sized nourishment was washed offshore during an unexceptional storm here. But the coarse grain stayed on the beach, and the differences in wave heights are not responsible. We think that it's because of the different grain sizes. The increased subaerial retention of the coarser than native sand is something that was predicted by Dean in 1991 and also observed by Kahn and Mohan on the East Coast using sediment samples in a different wave climate. All right, so that was cross-shore transport. Now let's look at long-shore transport. We're going to watch again the movie of Nourishment Evolution at Imperial Beach, but this time I'm just zooming in on the subaerial beach, and we have a lot more surveys there because we do the monthly ATP surveys, and we're not afraid of those because we don't get in the water for that. So let's go ahead and play this, and actually this time I've marked the center of mass of this volume, this subaerial volume, using this magenta X. So we're going to watch this nourishment stretch in the alongshore, and then we'll watch what the net direction of transport is at each moment in time. So here we go, the nourishment is stretching, and the sand is moving south in winter, just after nourishment placement. And then in the summer, it starts to move bit more north. And then in winter again, it moves south. We see this seasonal swinging of the center of mass, it's the same. Let's get a point here. So I can look at a time series of the alongshore position. What happened there? Oh, what happened there? A time series of the alongshore position of the center of mass. So you can see that it did shift seasonally. What we also notice is that the center of mass of the sand overall was moving southward. So this nourishment sand is overall moving southward. And that caused some drama because this winter the Tijuana River mouth was closed. It clogged. And that's bad because that creates anoxic and hyperpolluted conditions in the estuary, which is a threat to many endangered bird species, and it killed a whole bunch of leopard sharks, flooded the streets of Imperial Beach with nasty polluted water. So there was some drama around this. The picture that you see here is just after they had to dig out the blockage to reconnect the estuary with the ocean. All right, so enough drama. Let's go back to the time series of the Imperial Beach center of mass. And let's figure out what we would expect based on what we already know about longshore transport. And this is another video from Ian and Shelton to explain to us all about longshore transport.
You may have noticed that waves usually approach the coast at an angle, not straight on. The reason for this is that most waves are created by storm winds blowing far out at sea. If a storm occurred any place except here, say in one of these areas, then the waves created by the storm and traveling out from the storm area could approach the beach at an angle, not straight on. Today, the waves are coming in from the northwest. Notice what happens to the waves when they enter the shallow coastal waters. They bend and tend to become parallel to the shoreline. But as you can see, the bending is not always complete. The waves pass through the surf zone at an angle and strike the beach face at an angle. Watch. The dye shows that the water is moving down the coast as well. Now we'll repeat the experiment, this time putting another spot of dye just outside the breaking waves. The second spot of dye shows that the water outside the breaking wave hardly moves at all, while the dye within the surf zone moves rapidly down coast. When the waves enter the surf zone, they break at an angle and cause this down coast flow of water called a longshore current. Now let's see what this current does to the sand in the surf zone. From the air, the pattern is clear. The waves approach the shore at an angle. Even though they bend somewhat, they strike the beach face at an angle. In the surf zone, the sand grains are being moved not only back and forth, but also down the coast by the longshore current. Such movement of sand on the beach face and in the surf zone is called longshore transport. So we can think of the beach as a river of sand. The beach face is one bank of the river, the outer edge of the surf zone is the other. Much more sand is moved in the surf zone than along the beach face. These groins built along a nearby beach provide further proof of longshore transport. The sand is piled up on the same side of each barrier, thus showing the direction in which the sand is moving.
All right, so thanks to those guys for teaching us a little bit about longshore transport. I want you to keep this image of the jetty in your head and how that interacts with the longshore transport. Because Dean and you predicted that a nourishment would actually behave in a way that was similar to this jetty in the experiencing a longshore current. And they said that they thought that if you put coarse grained sand on top of finer grained sand, that coarse grained sand, which is harder to move, would act as just like a jetty, and that the native sized sand might build up on the side of it. And what I've done here is this is what the center of mass looked like just after nourishment. And here's what the center of mass would do as that sand piled up on the edge. So what you're seeing here is that the center of mass should actually move in the direction opposite of the longshore current, according to DMU's prediction. So what do we see? Well, here is our center of mass time series in Creole Beach. And then if I overlay what we would expect, if I overlay what the longshore currents are doing, here's a time series of the cumulative sum of hourly SXY, or the radiation stress that is correlated with the longshore currents. This is a proxy for longshore currents. What we see is that these two things are well correlated, but we are expecting them to move in opposite directions based on DMU's prediction. So this is a super interesting finding in that this nourishment pad was seemingly affected in the same direction as these longshore currents. If you look at Torrey Pines, that nourishment didn't stay on the beach for long, but we can look at just the beginning of the time series. That nourishment moved a bit southward, just slightly, which is consistent with this with the weak southward longshore currents. This is, the picture is a little bit more complicated at Solana and Cardiff Beach, but in general, this affection by longshore current is we find very interesting. So I'll just go ahead and summarize that theme for you, which is that these nourishments behave similar, all of them, in that they experience on and offshore transport due to seasonal fluctuations in wave energy. And their subaerial pads were affected by these seasonally shifting longshore currents. Lastly, the difference is that the coarse grain nourishments remain on the beach face for several years, even maintaining more elevated beaches during El Nino, while the Torrey Pines nourishment, built with a grain size similar to native, washed offshore in the first winter storm. So to summarize the whole dang thing, theme one was about beach profile evolution, and the observations suggest that that these profiles evolve toward equilibrium. Also, we saw that an equilibrium framework well models the temporal variability of the beach profile state. The little beach profile. And next theme was all about El Nino. And we saw that the wave conditions during this El Nino were big, and that it had lots of erosive power. So this winter's minimum subaerial sand levels at Torrey Pines were lower than they were in 2010, the last El Nino. Whereas the beaches that were nourished with sand, Vero Beach, Cardiff, and Solana, those were wider and more elevated than they were in the last El Nino. Which brings me to the last theme, nourishment evolution, where we saw that on and offshore transport was driven by seasonal fluctuations in wave energy. We saw that these coarse grain nourishments stayed on the subaerial beach longer than the finer grain ones, and that the subaerial pads were affected by longshore currents. That's it. Question? Bill?
So I may be too involved and have too much information, but so when you were showing the center of mass at IV moving to the south, that was just the center of mass in your defined blocks.
Yes, in the subaerial region.
Because, and then you had the blue color showing elevation going like way south, like down to the border.
Yeah.
Where did that information? We
Well,
surveyed there for a while.
so this center of mass information is just coming from this region, which goes down to the river mouth.
Right.
But I think that it is
Okay.
likely that some of that sand.
It's the center of mass in the nourishment pad area, but we have surveys all the
A few, yeah.
okay.
Can't see who that is, but, oh, JD. Yeah.
Well, when did the practice of nourishment sort of start becoming normal? And if it hadn't been done, would be cyclical, would you presume that we would just start building themselves back up?
Building. So I don't know the answer to your first question off the top of my head. I know papers that it would be, but I don't know the answer. And what was can you restate your second question?
Yeah, so does nature nourish by itself?
Like with these calmer waves?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately with this, we see George Hines,
Yeah.
go to the shore, line back out, and look all that.
So there was actually a section of my talk that I had to cut out due to time, which talked about how much sand in general is in the system. And so where does beach sand come from? And it's mostly from rivers. When rivers flood, they bring sand to the beach. But all of our rivers in San Diego County, except for one, are dammed. So in theory, you might see that we are having decreasing sand levels. That said, Southern California has never had super wide beaches like other places. We often have naturally potholes in winter. There were a handful of nourishments in the 80s due to dredging of harbors, so these sort of opportunistic nourishments, which widen the beaches and sort of changes people's baseline for what the beaches should look like. So in a sense, I guess the nature would be nourishing the beaches with sand, but we sort of cut off those natural processes. The other ways are some of that sand sometimes comes from eroding cliffs, but many of those cliffs have seawalls over them, protecting them from failing. So we can theoretically cut off the source of sediment. Back.
Do you have any sense for how the wave height and the beach level stacked up? 97, 98, I know you didn't show data back that far, but
So
do you
that
have that kind of data for that?
I haven't looked at that, but that is in this paper that I'm collaborating on with the folks at USGS, and I think that this El Nino did have big waves similar to these past sort of monstrous El Ninos.
Do you care to comment as to why? Because in a lot of ways, this element didn't help connect in the ways that we expected it to relative.
With rainfall.
But it did. It appears to be the case in the waves. So, would you care to comment on that at all?
I don't know the answer to why that is. Bryce?
In your equilibrium model with burning bar profiles,
Mhm.
what determines the location of that pressure point where there's no major movement when the changes in equilibrium?
Yeah, so actually you're bringing up a great point. The EOF analysis is essentially limited to standing waves. So there's going to be a node somewhere, which means that part of the beach won't be moving much as described by the first EOF. But that's a limitation of the EOF. So there is movement there. We don't get that part of the profile right because that's a limitation of the model. So when I sort of broadly said this model breaks down where the EOF doesn't describe the variability, that includes sort of the mid-profile depths, which is a big downfall of that model. And I tried to address that using higher mode EOFs, also looking at complex EOFs, which I didn't really have much luck, but that's a great question. We did look into that quite a bit.
The follow-up question was, presumably that point does exist somewhere, even if it's not as simple.
Oh. Yeah.
And so does that have any influence on where you would put your
Yeah, how do you construct nourishment? So there's a lot of different ways to construct or to put sand on the beach. Some people actually nourish, they do what's called a shore nourishment, and they put it just offshore, and they wait for the calmer waves to move that stuff onshore. The Dutch created a mega nourishment, which basically was a huge, massive perturbation in the coastline. I got to go out there and look at that sand engine a couple years ago. Yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways to do it, and I think the jury's still out on what is the best method. Sarah?
So I think I might have just not looked into the plot correctly. When we were comparing the long short transport to the power fast,
Yes.
it looked like the long short transport actually.
Yeah. So So this is actually kind of a surprising phenomenon, this entire thing. If you were to really try and model how these sand levels changed, you wouldn't look at these sort of like mean alongshore currents. What you would need to do is look at the alongshore gradients in the alongshore current. And so this is really crude. This is really not modeling the alongshore evolution of this beach nourishment. That would require a much more sophisticated model, which is actually what I'm going to go and do next. But this is just sort of showing that this nourishment is moving in the same direction of the alongshore current. The fact that there's a little bit of a lag, I think that's interesting, but I don't think we should read too much into it because this is already sort of not really a physics-based thing. It's just sort of like, this is what we observed, which is cool because it's sort of the opposite of what we predicted. Yeah.
So when you are nourishing, you are changing the other way.
Connected to.
How it's changing it.
Yeah, I should have pointed that out. So that first chapter is actually totally separate from these nourishments because we're just looking at natural beaches. And if you add a big bump to the upper beach, that totally changes the relationship that you have along the cross-shore profile. So that UF again is not going to be relevant when you put something on the upper beach. In terms of what was your question again?
I guess can you predict what's going to be the new equilibrium?
Yeah. So I don't know is the real answer, but Dean in that 1991 paper looked at equilibrium profiles, but kind of in a different sense, and theorized that you eventually come to the same shape, but if you have more sand in the system, the whole profile would be elevated. But yeah, that's all I got. Brian.
So by the influx of the native sand, is it bypassing the pad? I mean, are we making the assumption that the sand grain, coarse grain is staying there, it's not using any cut as far as time progresses?
Or so, are you talking about
I guess
this?
it's only that the sand grain, the grain size kind of makes the pad stay there, but when you have this infusion of the native grain size, is the average grain size changing over years?
Yeah, I mean, I think you would expect that if we took sediment samples, that these samples would change in their distribution. Yeah, so I showed this little cartoon, and what we saw was actually the opposite of what these guys saw. But so we know that the nourishment sand is being moved around by the alongshore in the direction of the alongshore current. And I think that when I say nourishment sand, I mean, I'm really talking about the entire beach. So I haven't really isolated that in any way. But because it is such a large variation, I think we can say that it's probably the center of mass shifting is probably due to that. Do you want to rephrase the question or have another whack at it?
So, is there a grain size? Would that be like the cobbles? You say usually right? I mean, the other people would say.
Yeah.
I mean,
You know,
how
in
big
their
would that
paper,
be?
they specifically say coarse grained sand.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah, but you would think that if you get to something that is hard enough to move, that might.
If that was one huge concrete block, the grain size is the size of the nourishment, then it wouldn't move it and there'd be accretion. So somewhere between the big solid block,
And a J.
which won't move, and that sand which was coarse but still moved, I don't know if you can make a cobble thing or not. People have tried making cobbles. Engineers have tried a whole suite of things, but they forget to look at what they do. So we never know how they perform.
Any other questions? Ron?
So based
based on this research, what would you tell planners and engineers who were planning?
So, well, in terms of the native and the enforced argument, there are a few different reasons why people, there are a few different things that determine the type of sand you put on the beach. And the first thing is what's available. So you're very much limited by what sand you have access to. And then also, there are some places where they won't allow you to put coarse grain sand on the beach, and that's because these coarser grains, I didn't show it, but these coarser grains create much steeper they create a much steeper profile on the upper beach. And that sometimes is problematic for beach safety if swimmers are going to go to the beach and they've got this big sort of wall between them and potentially big waves. That's an issue. And then also surfers, actually Surf Rider Foundation has not been super happy with these nourishments because it's created at some of these sites a shore break and sometimes even like big reflected waves off of this steep profile. So for that reason, sometimes people prefer a sand grain size that's similar to native. But if your goal was to keep it on the beach, then I would say coarse grain sand. I think also you might want to think about the fact that these nourishments are not staying in one place in the long shore. So, for example, whether or not you put them near a river mouth, that river mouth was a couple kilometers. It was far away. I'm thinking a kilometer and a half away from where this nourishment was, so they probably didn't cross their mind. But these things can move around quite a bit, so that's also something that the planners really need to think about. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, well, if that's it for questions, then we'll excuse the audience and committee.
Thank you, slide. Thank you, slide.
Oh!